Jan Hamer, welcome to the Physical Performance Show for this expert edition.
Hey Brad, it's good to be here.
You and I met several years ago in clinic, and I immediately warmed to your story. And then we've been in touch, I guess, professionally over the ensuing years. And I think it was one of the early conversations we might have said this would be a great story to get featured on this program, the
Yeah,
Physical Performance Show. And here we are many years later, finally getting to it. So it's worth a wait though, Jen.
absolutely. And I think these things, like timing is always pivotal for these things. And I think both personally and professionally, now is the right time. I don't think if we'd have done it a few years back, it wouldn't have been the same. So I think it's a great time to be doing it. And yeah, what we'll speak about today is very topical at the moment. So yeah, it's great to be here.
So Jen, uh, there's a few, I guess, key terms, key areas to explore in our recording. Those key areas being physique considerations in high performance sport, concept of body image, relative energy deficiency in sport, a cultural shift that you feel needs to occur, and I guess in some ways might be occurring, and then the role that education plays in athlete well-being with regards to body image, energy availability, and therefore well-being and optimal performance. It's a big area. But Jen, before we even dive into the detail, this is not something that is not close to your heart. You've got your own lived journey, and you've got your PhD looking at supporting coaches to manage the risks of low energy availability among developing athletes. So you've got professional runs on the board, but you've also had your own story. So tell us a little bit about your background.
Sure. So I was a high performing athlete growing up, specialized in two sports. I was an endurance runner and cricket player. Two very contrasting sports, but absolutely thrived in both of them. But I actually developed an eating disorder at the age of 12. So I spent most of my athletic career functioning with an eating disorder. I did manage to make it to the European Championships for endurance running to represent Great Britain when I was 16. Um, but honestly, Brad, like over the years, I was always the one who was winning a race and then getting injured, then winning a race, getting injured again. So a lot of my training was always rehab, getting myself ready to go again, and then the body would break. Um, but around the age of 18, I really started to sort of have a real decline into a more serious case of my eating disorder, and was admitted to an inpatient unit when I was 22. Stayed there for a year, and I was pretty in a critical condition when I was there. But I found a real drive when I was in there to recover because I still wanted to be an athlete. Um, so that became a little bit of my driving force through my recovery. But that dream came shattering down when I was diagnosed with osteoporosis at 23, and made several attempts to return to running and cricket, and um, developed multiple stress fractures every time I attempted to do that. So I think the realization hit home that I couldn't be the athlete I wanted to be. So bit of an identity loss, and then decided to put my energy towards what could I give back. And so that was where it led me down the path of research, and my undergraduate degree in sport and exercise science. I then did my master's in clinical nutrition and eating disorders, and then yeah, got to come over to Australia and do my PhD in, as you said, supporting coaches to manage the risks of relative energy deficiency in sport. And in that time, I've done a lot of sort of advocacy work in the eating disorder space in high performance sport. In terms of myself, I'm really proud to say that I don't have osteoporosis anymore. And as you've worked with me as professionally, but also as my practicing physio, you've seen those changes over the years in bone density for me, which has been wonderful to enable me to get back to doing sport in a capacity that isn't at the elite level, but engaged in a way that's fulfilling. And so, yeah, now I've finished my PhD, so I'm still sort of consulting in that high performance space, working on multiple projects around managing physique issues in high performance sport, looking at how we actually educate across this space beyond the delivery of knowledge. And that's where I really touch on the idea of like how we shift the culture that exists in sport to one, mitigate risk, but also equip stakeholders with the skills to identify concerns and know what to do when they do identify concerns. So yeah, that's probably my life story in a quick few minutes.
And I know there's so much more that you could color that with, you know, lots of highs and lows through your own personal journey. But I think what's key there, Jen, is those own experiences, your lived experiences, birth that passion in you to try and then help others that were going, may go through a similar journey. And I've just written down a few things that you said there. Um, the culture shift in sport, mitigate risk and identify concerns. And maybe we start there and go backwards from a couple of those key points that you mentioned. It's a big topic and there's no easy place to start. So let's work backwards. The culture that exists in sport, hard question, but what do you mean by that? Is it anything tangible? Is it mistaken beliefs, lack of knowledge?
Yeah.
What's the culture?
Yeah. In one sentence, I think we've developed an overly performance-driven culture, which could be a controversial statement because I would probably get a lot of people arguing that we need overly performance-driven environments. But what we've had with an overly performance-driven environment is the lack of consideration for health and well-being. And so we've taken a focus away of the fact that health and well-being is fundamental to a performance outcome. And so if our athletes haven't got that, we can't expect them to reach sustainable success. And so what I would say we have is largely a culture which is unaware of the risks, especially when it comes to things like low energy availability, REDs, eating disorders, and disordered eating in sport. In terms of knowledge, there is definitely a lack of knowledge, but it's one that I grapple with a lot because I think you can deliver knowledge to coaches, athletes, high performance staff, but the knowledge doesn't necessarily challenge behaviours and beliefs which are outdated, which are born from opinion rather than what we know to be true. And so for me, it's recognising with each group, whether it's a coach, a manager, an athlete, a performance support staff, what knowledge do they actually need from the science? And then working out from that, what skills and capabilities do they actually need to be equipped with to implement into their practice? And I think for me, that's the missing piece, is that a lot of the time we're seeing a lot of resources being developed, which are absolutely brilliant to create awareness and get people thinking about this. But that knowledge is nothing if they don't know what to do with it and they don't know how to actually translate that knowledge into practice. And I think that's the disconnect that we lack currently in our educations for sports. In terms of my experiences through my work with sports, in terms of whether it's a beliefs, an attitudes, a lack of knowledge, it's a combination of many of those things. What I have learnt through my PhD was that the majority of coaches I've worked with want to do the right thing, but they've never been equipped, as I said, with those skills and capabilities to know what the right thing is. And often the beliefs they hold, this is not every coach. We know that there are some coaches out there who have done very terrible things, and we don't need to name names there. We know who they are. But for the majority of the coaches I've worked with, they've been really unaware of some of the things that they may say or the things that they they believe to be true and how that can negatively impact their athlete. But what they are is enthusiastic and open to being supported to make the appropriate changes. But that's what they need. They need that ongoing support, somebody who's on their side, really, to guide them through what is an incredibly challenging thing. And I never forget Cliff Mallet. I don't know if you've ever had Cliff on the show, but he's a big shout out to Cliff if he's listening. So incredible researcher at UQ, University of Queensland, and he works largely in coach education. And I had the opportunity to jump on a call with Cliff and tell him about my work when I started my PhD. And his words to me were, "You've put yourself in the trenches." And what he meant by that was cultural shift, especially in the world of coach practice and coach education. It's arduous, it's slow, it's really hard. But I think you got to start somewhere, right? And just because it's hard doesn't mean we shouldn't do it.
Gosh, powerful.
Yeah.
Powerful. You're in the trenches, Dr.
Yeah.
Jen.
Been in them for 5 years.
um, so I've just captured some of what you've shared there. And that was we've got to challenge beliefs and behaviors. These can be driven by opinion versus truth. Can you give any practical examples? And you pointed out that education in and of itself, as good and as noble as that isn't always enough. Can you give any practical examples potentially from sport of where there has been beliefs and behaviors that have been challenged because of the education, and like a practical example perhaps that people out there listening in listenership may be able to draw upon? Or is that too open of question?
Here's an answer, and I'm not sure if I'm going to answer your question, but it will still be a valid piece of information. So a big project we did with Swimming Australia, it was called the What's a Coach to Do project, and it was an education intervention for coaches to support them in understanding relative energy deficiency in sport, but really trying to empower and equip them with the language and the behaviours and the confidence to actually go into their swimming environment and create a holistic environment which is supportive of athlete well-being, mitigating risks of REDs, and for them to know what to do if they have a concern. And we largely had a group. So the initial pilot of that was about 40 coaches we had in the workshop, and they came from all different swim clubs from over Australia. And we sat them in their working groups because we wanted it to be very specific to their own environment. And a lot of the coaches were very receptive to the education, but we had one coach who could not understand why saying to a swimmer as she walks into a competition that you're looking super lean, you're going to swim really fast was a problem. And so we broke it down and we kind of said, well, you don't know how that swimmer's got to that weight anyway. And it might have been through very unhealthy practices. But his argument was, yeah, but she looked really lean, and I know that if she's lean, she's going to swim fast. And we were like, well, how do you know that that's the variable that means she's going to swim fast? Couldn't it have been a performance variable? Couldn't it have been from her training? Couldn't it have been from any other thing that she's been doing that's relevant to her performance outcome? But there's this real fixation, especially in our endurance sports among the coaches, that they look at a physique and they think that that physique is what's going to either win a race, or if they're not at the physique that they believe to be successful, they're going to lose a race. And it's very a black and white view. And we actually had some real great sort of presentation, but coaches in the room that actually challenged him, which was really great to see, because they were like, no, you just don't say that. It's not appropriate. And it was really good to see that sort of rhetoric being used and the coaches challenging another coach on using physique-based language. So I think that was where I was mentioning that there is some real sort of there are coaches who are receptive to this change. I think inevitably I have to accept, and it's a hard thing for me to accept, is that we're never going to be able to get everyone to come on board with this. So for me, the next thing, so if I say, okay, if everyone can't come on board, what am I trying to do? And I think what I'm trying to do is to get as many stakeholders within the sport to buy into this, to understand what's appropriate and what's not appropriate, to set a benchmark for what we expect in terms of culture, and to a point where they are not afraid to call someone out if they see bad behavior. And I think that's what my benchmark aim is that people working in national sporting organisations, NIN hubs, sports clubs, wherever they understand what a good culture looks like to the point that they are so confident in it that they're not afraid to call someone out for using poor behavior in terms of athlete well-being and even staff well-being. This isn't just our athletes, right? So I think that's probably where my goal is when I work in this space now, is knowing that not everyone's going to come on board, but if we can get the majority confident enough in this space, they can help be the ones who are our advocates as well.
Yeah, so that's a really uh, interesting example and a thought-provoking one. That coach that was challenged by their peers, um, did the lights come on? Did the penny drop, or was there still didn't quite the pro the thinking wasn't quite there to understand why that comment
Mm.
could have a negative effect on the athlete?
Yeah, it was a very much, this is the way I do things, this is my belief, and I'm not shifting it. And so that's what I mean by, I'm like, there's some coaches that I think will just be very resilient and resistant because it's the way they've always done it, and it's the way they think that they've always got success, and this is how I get athletes to win, by the way that I coach and the way that I practice. And we didn't really get him to come round. And I think, look, there's been some other examples with triathlon in my most recent project where, again, there's some very inappropriate language being used still with the athletes. And some of it was really confronting and quite hard to hear what was being said still, to the point where I was really shocked that some things that I heard were still being said around athletes' physique and body image and weight in the performance environment. And we debriefed with the sport, and this project was all around sort of understanding the physique culture that exists within the sport. So we spoke to all the athletes, we spoke to coaches, support staff, managers. We interviewed them to understand their perceptions of what is the physique culture in terms of beliefs, behaviours, practices, processes, policies. And on that feedback, the sport was very receptive to recognizing that, yeah, that behavior has to be cut out. But even on that feedback, there was still this kind, I could still feel a bit of tension that we still want physique to be a real focus in our sport. And so it's always this push and pull of like recognizing that, okay, it's going to be a part of a sport, but how can we make it as safe and holistic and really, in a way, empower the athletes, get them to be so resilient to this sort of the language and the behaviors that don't support them, and get them to call it out. And I think that's a real opportunity in itself, is where we're not getting buy-in from other stakeholders, it's using the athletes, get them so empowered and resilient and strong, to just reject this commentary completely, which is hard because I know when you sort of hear those things, it can be incredibly triggering. And I don't think there's one answer to this. I feel like this is why it's a conversation that will go on forever, because it's such a complex area.
Would that be empowering the athlete, Jen, to, say, look, that's not appropriate. I'm not taking that comment on board, or empower the athlete to then speak to the relevant person in the performance environment, well-being, health and well-being manager, if we're talking about a high performance environment, etc. I mean, as a clinician, I've had many stories, and you have some key considerations in clinical practice around patient confidentiality and duty of care and do no harm.
Mm.
And the view typically take is to empower the athlete to speak up through the appropriate channels. Uh, but I imagine that might be one way to try and drive change and culture shift is to empower the athlete to speak up. You may or may not wish to share, but I'm wondering to the listener, this is quite familiar to us because we work around it and see it in our professional lives. But are there any, you at liberty, or do you feel to share any phrases that got used? I mean, I'll go first around as a clinician, something I've spoken before on this program about. I've even shared it with you when we've been in the same room together. That naively, I used to comment to athletes as they presented in clinic, that I thought they were looking fit. And that was out of a position of trying to genuinely encourage them, but it was also out of a total lack of appreciation for what might be having them look fit, as you pointed out before. And it was only my own journey into realizing I had low bone density after 12 years of junior triathlon into adulthood, and that I realized, oh my gosh, there is so much to this. And I can't believe I ever said that. And I'm definitely never using language like that again. And I've just adopted the policy, or no practitioner should comment on an athlete's body at all unless it's specific to the uh, clinical condition. You might be talking about, your hip or something that, but even then you've got to be so circumspect with your language. My great physio when I was a junior triathlete, Suzanne, uh, she's one of the reasons I went into physio. She once said to me, Brad, you've got childbearing hips, tibial torsion, flat feet, bowed legs. And I remember as a 16-year-old boy just feeling like the floor fell away from me. And here I am, 44. I've never forgotten that. I've never forgotten how that made me feel. And I vowed if I ever went into this work that I'd never use language like that loosely because of the effect it can have. So, Jen, are there any phrases that you've heard that are really triggering that people might be able to go, you know what, that's not helpful, or terms?
Two things I want to say. I'm going to come to the phrases in a moment, and I've got some that I can share. But I actually just want to spin back to that comment that you drew on there when you used to say maybe, oh, you're looking really fit. Because I'm wondering that there'll be some listeners on here thinking, well, what's wrong with that by saying like you look fit? I'm going to share from my lived experience perspective as someone, if I'd have walked in and someone says to me, you're looking really fit, automatically my association goes, okay, I'm looking good right now. This is how I have to look. And then it's a fixation on this is the body that I need to keep. This is the ideal, and that's attached to my worth because that's the thing that's been complimented because that's what someone said is good about me. You're looking really fit. So I'm like, okay, that's associated to my worth and that's how I need to look. And it sounds so black and white, but that was honestly how my eating disorder worked. And I know it's how a lot of others that I've spoken to is we cling on to these comments. Like you clinged on to that one, yours wasn't even an eating disorder, but you clung on to that comment that was made and it became part of you. And it then gets attached to your identity. And I think that's a real psychological conversation that we don't need to go down. But I just wanted to break that down because I think some people find it hard to understand why it's not appropriate. But when you've had a lived experience, it's just at the forefront. As soon as someone comments on your appearance, it's what you cling to, and it's so hard to let that go. So thank you for sharing that. In terms of some phrases that, look, I've had, some have been incredibly confronting and really hard to hear, but like we had one the other day, which was, so for the listener, I'm putting my fingers to touch and I'm spreading my hands wide. So I'm creating like the width of my, or the length of my two hands together. An approach said if an athlete's hips don't fit to the width of my hands when they're together, they're never going to win a race. And like, where does that come from? Points like at competitions, coaches is pointing out other athletes from different countries and saying you need to look like this to be successful. One of the worst was that calling one of the athletes and saying to another coach, she looks like a Teletubby, she's never going to run fast. This is disgusting language, and there's no other way about it, right? And like I've just said, it stays with you. This has really affected these athletes, not just in the short term, but the long term. And I don't think sometimes when coaches say this, even if it's said in jest, I don't think anyone can justify those statements. But even if they're said in jest, I don't think they begin to understand the impact that that has on the mental health of an athlete for the long term, and what it can mean in terms of behaviours around food and exercise in their body.
Yep. Oh gosh, and I think the maybe to just paint the picture in case there's a listener that hasn't fully sort of appreciated how this can play out, you might be performing well in a body composition that we'd identify as being lean, but who's to say that you might not have performed even better if you weren't in that body composition? And
Yeah,
so it's this mistaken belief or cause association between leanness and performance, which can
yeah,
go too far. Uh,
yeah,
Jen, it actually really infuriates me out of the carelessness sometimes. And you've got to give grace where there's ignorance. Like you said, you had the room full of coaches and lights were possibly going on and some were staying dim. But my mother-in-law, when my wife had our third baby and I was tired and I stood in the corner of the room and I yawned, I think it was a yawn of relief. And my mother-in-law, she's a passionate Portuguese lady, Jen. She said to me, "Shut your face." And I it was, quite a moment, but it makes me, I feel like saying that when I hear of athletes tell me stories and I hear comments in passing, I feel like saying, "Shut your face." Like you have
yeah,
no idea that what that statement might be doing. Whose right is it for you to comment on that athlete's body type? It's just
yeah,
deplorable.
yeah. And I think add as well, just to touch on it as well, because a lot of this starts in the pathways. And some of the feedback I got from some of the triathletes was these poor behaviors that I developed were in the pathways when I was young, because I was being fed poor messaging through coaching at that level. So poor dietary practices, poor relationship, developing poor relationships with their body image at a younger age. And then they get categorized and they're in the elite system, and high pressure, all the lights are on them, media. Um, and they're now trying to unlearn these poor behaviors because it's had such a poor impact on their mental health, some of them their physical health. And an athlete said to me, "Do you know how hard it is to unlearn?" And I mean, I can sit here and say, yeah, I do, but it's starting early as well. So I think that's going to speak to more of an education piece. But like, I can't emphasize enough that it's throughout the system. It's not just at the top. It's starting early in the pathways where athletes are falling prey to really poor behaviors because of the messaging that they're getting.
Starts early. Jen, body image dissatisfaction is a term. I've been doing a little bit of research in this with some study I'm doing at the moment. What's the definition of body image dissatisfaction in thereabouts? Like when I say that to you, what does that mean to you?
Perception one has of their own body, and it's a perception that's in a negative light. It's not necessarily a true reflection of their image. It's how they perceive themselves. And I think we know that body image can be influenced by a multitude of factors, societal factors, diet culture, messaging they receive in the sport. I think we cannot get away from social media at the moment and the impacts that's having on body image for athletes and just the general public. Negative body image in my recovery has been something which has been incredibly challenging, and I think it's often harder And this is a very vulnerable and honest share. I think when I stepped into your clinic when I'd arrived in Australia and just started my PhD, and I probably still wasn't physically in a great place health wise. I would probably say that I was still in low energy availability, and it was great. I sought some help from expert dietitians and yourself and some great sports physicians as well who actually helped me. Now, with that recovery from REDS doesn't always lead to weight gain, like but it did for me, and that needed to happen. And it was quite a significant weight gain that needed to happen. And I never forget like opening my wardrobe and trying on clothes, and literally I was like, doesn't fit, doesn't fit, doesn't fit. And I phoned my mom just sobbing because I just didn't like this new body. And just looking at myself in the mirror in this body that was it was healthy, but for me, I just didn't like it. But I think it was learning that actually my body wasn't the problem. It was the thoughts about my body that was the problem. And I think that's a really interesting one because when we think of body image dissatisfaction, we go straight to the body rather than the mind. So it's like, well, actually, let's not try and fix the body. Let's try and fix the mind. Um, and for me, what was really a powerful moment was realizing all the things that I could actually do um, with a body that was now healthy. And as you know, I was able to go back to doing small amounts of running, my bone density restored, my gym work just soared in terms of my strength and conditioning. Um, and so it was really translating the message from being a real negative perception on what I look like to actually what can I do now? And I'm strong and I'm powerful, and that's the messaging, right? But it's not easy. And I think I would be lying to say I still don't have days where I really struggle with it. But I think the self-awareness of recognizing that actually these thoughts aren't facts. It's like that little niggling gremlin that lives in your mind and tries to lie to you, but it's just remembering that yeah, it's not a body problem, it's the mind trying to convince you otherwise.
Gosh, that's so profound. I have not done a PhD in this space, Jen, and we'll leave that to good people that are courageous enough like yourself. But a finding that I had that it came out, which I found quite challenging, and it speaks to that point, is it was a 2023 systematic review where they found that in female athletes, what they phrased normal weighted female athletes reported higher levels of body image dissatisfaction than their underweight counterparts. So the problem wasn't the body, the problem was the mind.
I
Yeah.
think then that's always a reminder because often people unhappy with their body image, their responses will let's change my body. Let's do something about it. Let's change my size. Let's change my physique. Let's lose weight, whatever they might try and do to address their body image. And it's like, no, leave that part alone. Let's address the mind and the psychological aspect of this because your body's not the problem. Um, and if we could only do that, I think there'd be a lot less body image dissatisfaction in the world.
Yeah, gosh. And I mean, in case a listener is sort of going, well, I guess isn't it normal that everyone has something they don't like about their body? Not my place to answer that, but the effects of heightened levels of body image dissatisfaction are physiological effects, psychological effects. If we talk in the sport environment, potentially compromise sporting participation, and you use that phrase at the start, sustained success, the ability to actually sustain any success. You know, there's higher rates of anxiety, depression, suicidality, substance abuse if you have heightened levels of body image dissatisfaction. So this is it's a big potential driver for many negative effects in life and
Yeah,
health.
yeah, it's a huge area, and one that's really not received enough attention, I don't think.
Jen, uh, in terms of energy availability, it's a topic we've explored through various experts over the years. We throw the term REDS around, or formerly Red S around, lightly and easily because we know what we're referencing there. But I guess two questions I'd ask you and through your PhD. One, what's your sort of working definition or example of relative energy deficiency in sport and what the listener needs to know about that? And two, do you see or do you think or has there been scientifically a shift in the awareness of this in the sporting environment?
I guess in terms of my definition, let's keep it simple. We know that REDS is a condition when an athlete is living in a state of low energy availability over a prolonged period or has repeated acute bouts. So when I say repeated acute bouts, that's like they could be in low energy availability a week and then they come out for a few days and then they drop back in for a week and then they come out for a few days. So they're sort of in low energy availability more than they're not. So that's our repeated acute bouts or prolonged. And we know from recent studies that we have seen, I think it was Melissa, I forget her last name, she's in the States. Oh, isn't that terrible? She does a huge amount of work in the low energy availability space, and I should know her last name. But they identified that there was some impacts to bone resorption markers after as little as 3 weeks. So we know it doesn't take a long period of time for someone to be in low energy availability to start seeing the implications of REDS. So essentially, if an athlete doesn't eat enough or consume enough energy for what they expend through their training and exercise to meet the requirements of normal physiological function, then they enter low energy availability. And if they're in that for a little while too long, they'll develop REDS. And as you know, and I know, REDS can lead to many physiological and psychological health implications. So we can see reduced bone density, reduced metabolic rate, implications to immune health, nutrient deficiencies, gastrointestinal distress. And then psychologically, it's an interesting one because we know some athletes develop REDS unintentionally, just don't know how much to eat. And so they end up not eating enough, and they're quite easy to treat because you tell them what to eat and then they go away and they match their energy levels, and we kind of see that restoration. But then some others are more complex. And I guess this has always been a tricky one for me, is that because I would have been defined to have had REDS, but I also had an eating disorder. So it's, do you say I had an eating disorder? Do you say I had REDS? Do you say I had both? So we also know that some athletes will develop REDS with an eating disorder or some form of disordered eating. And that's obviously a little more tricky to treat because of the psychological input that's needed. And we know that obviously if an athlete experiences those health implications, that's also going to lead to the performance implications. So negative performance implications for them. In terms of, do I think there's been a shift and an increase in awareness? I do. I think the research is moving faster than we're getting it on the ground. Obviously, we initially had the 2018, we had the 2014 was the initial IOC consensus statement on REDS. Then we had an update in 2018, and then we've had an update in 2023, with the research moving on really fast. And I think that's always a problem in research in general, but especially in high performance sport, is it's moving along, but we're just not getting that translation, that like filtering down onto the ground quick enough. And that which is being filtered down, I tend to see as lots of articles online, little online modules that maybe people can do, which, as I said, it's fabulous, like creates awareness. But a lot of the time, you find that people who are reading or engaging in that stuff have got a biased interest in it, and they're sort of already passionate about that space, whereas actually we need the people who are to be immersed in that. So that's one thing around the awareness. But as I touched on earlier, I don't think, for me, awareness isn't enough. It's great to know it's a problem. It's great to know what it is. But then your coach is going to say, well, what do I do? And that's the real hard part, is because it's not a one-stop fix. And I think my final study of my PhD really highlighted this. So we evaluated the workshop that I delivered to Swimming Australia, and we used a model called the COM-B model. So it looked at capability, opportunity, and motivation for the coaches to implement new behaviours and skills that they'd learn in the workshop. And so those three elements were our proxy for behaviour change. And I did a roundtable focus group with the coaches, looking at developing questions that looked at those three areas: capability, opportunity, and motivation. And we did this 6 weeks after the workshop. And what we found was that coaches had an increased psychological capability. So they understood what REDS was, they understood why it was a problem, but they still lacked the physical capability to implement new behaviours. And that was tied to their confidence. So we delivered an incredibly powerful workshop, and we saw some great changes in motivation, opportunity. They were looking for opportunities, but they lacked the confidence to actually physically go and implement new behaviours. And that wasn't a surprise, because we're literally changing culture. And so one workshop is not going to shift entire behaviours. It's like anything. When you learn things at school, when you learn stuff, when you were becoming a physio, you had repeated exposure or repeated practice to get things right. And so that's where it becomes a challenge, because that's a question of resources, time, money, that needs to be put in to enable somebody or an employee to be that support for coaches when we are trying to challenge the system. So it is a hard one. Some sports are really charging ahead, like swimming have done some great stuff since that project, and they really are doing some great work. And there are some other sports that are really trying to address this now, but I still struggle and grapple with the fact that a lot of the time I just see more and more resources coming out, which are understandable, but they're not usable.
Understandable, but not usable. So it's when you just said like a physio and you said repeated exposure, and I thought to myself, I'm still trying to get it right, Jen. I need more repeated exposure 19 years
Exactly.
in. But then that was a bit of
Yeah.
a sobering reflection, because it's like stuff doesn't always change quickly, but you need the opportunity to grow
Yes.
and the
Yes.
support.
Yeah. But there's also with you, Brad, there is a real drive and motivation to do the right thing. And so you are constantly seeking information and opportunities to implement behaviors which are appropriate and correct and helpful and supportive. And so that's the other part of it as well. You've got to have a group of motivated people who are going to work with you.
Gosh, so interesting. So you need the capability. I think you said the opportunity, the motivation.
Yes,
Yep.
yes.
Uh, wow. Jen, there's definitely going to need to be a part two at some point to this. And maybe we
Absolutely.
like we're not finished now, but we'll catch up potentially in 12 months down the road and see what inroads have been made,
Yeah,
and
absolutely.
reflect on the wins that you've had in this space. But I think practically, let's play a little three tips game if you're up for it, for the different stakeholders in sport, from Dr. Jen Hamer's work thus far.
Mhm.
Three tips to parents, Jen, to the parents out there nurturing developing athletes, which is right up the alley of your PhD, supporting coaches to manage the risks of low energy availability among developing athletes. But if we remove the word coach for a moment and put in parent, what would
Mhm.
be Dr. Jen's top three tips to the parents out there with young developing athletes in trying to avoid the
Mhm.
pitfalls of low energy availability, relative energy deficiency in sport, body image dissatisfaction, etc.?
Yeah. So a recent example has literally led me to what I'll say here. Developing athletes' bodies are going to change. And I think it's really important for parents to not become obsessive around their developing athlete's body if they believe it might be too heavy or not of the stereotypical physique that they think their athletes should have. We have to allow that athlete to go through that developmental stage, And yes, we know that in some endurance sports, that may mean that for a period of time, that athlete might be slightly heavier than they would be for their optimal performance. And that's okay because we're building a sustainable athlete for many years, right? And so we have to allow that process to happen naturally, rather than try and interfere and cause more harm than good and lead to a very short athletic career. So I think that's quite a broad piece of advice, but I think it's a really important piece to recognize that yes, their body is changing during that time and let it change, and keep fueling them well. Please don't restrict your developing athletes intake because that developmental stage, as you know, requires so much energy, and then they're training on top. I think we underestimate how much they need. So as a parent, if in doubt, give them some more.
Wow. I think that's, if in doubt, give them some more, fuel well, uh, and accept body changes.
Yeah.
For the Yeah, this is directly related to your PhD, so it's probably an unfair question given that your PhD from memory was nearly 200 pages, I think, something like that.
So I was having to write far too much, and so it's always better to write too much than not enough. And so we had to make a big cutback, but we got there in the end.
So, but boiling down your PhD into three top tips for coaches out there listening in terms of managing the risks of low energy availability and developing athletes.
Yeah. I think first and foremost, it's try to get informed. So, if you aren't aware already of relative energy deficiency in sport, I know I've critiqued some of the resources out there, but if you don't know what it is, um, start asking your sport if they have resources. If they don't, the AIS have some resources on their website. There is a lot coming out online. Like, I mean, if you Google relative energy deficiency in sport, like it comes up everywhere now, which is great. I think there's a long way to go with education, but it's a start, right? If you're a coach and you don't know anything, that's a starting point. Um, I think I would like coaches to be open to be challenged on their beliefs. So recognize that that is an opportunity for growth, not a critique of your practice. And understand that as the science evolves, as we understand more about athlete health and performance, that means that potentially your coaching and practice is going to evolve too. So be open and curious to what that means for your practice. And I think the third one, and I think we both agree on this, is just don't comment on an athlete's body. Let's have the professionals who may conduct body composition assessments and be able to interpret that with athletes in an appropriate way, which may be a dietitian. That's the only time I can think that it's appropriate for a clinician to be talking to an athlete about their body, and it will be done in a very holistic way. But as a coach, there are so many things you can report on in terms of their performance, their technique, skill-based feedback that is far more valuable than anything that you can comment on their body.
We better not, should we phrase that one, shut your face?
Yeah.
So, but no, working backwards, don't comment on an athlete's body, be open and curious to be challenged on your beliefs and get informed. Ask your sport about resources, go to the AIS website. Um, Great. And then, Jen, for the practitioners out there, would there be three different tips for the practitioners that are working with athletes? And I probably should rephrase practitioners to health support team or stakeholders that engage with athletes for the purpose of providing care.
Perspective, one little line that I've been using a lot recently, this probably works for the athlete, but also from a dietitian's perspective with Reds, is I always say, eat enough, sometimes too much, never not enough. And for me, that's just a really nice, simple way to basically say, this is how we're avoiding low energy availability. Sometimes a little bit too much food is going to happen, and that's okay. But we can't afford to have you not eating enough. So I love that. I think it's a great one to take away. In terms of practitioners who are working with their athletes, I think I would come back to them really trying to help their athletes become resilient and empowered in this space. So that also requires the practitioner to be informed, but it's supporting them to know that they need to challenge behaviours that aren't supportive of their health and well-being. They've got a voice, a powerful voice, this powerful voice in sport, right? And so they need to be able to know that if something is said to them or if there's a behaviour done that they don't agree with, they need to raise it and they need to feel empowered to do that. So I would be encouraging practitioners to really support their athletes in that space. And that might be an opportunity for some practitioners to develop educational pieces or workshops with their athletes in ways that they're going to do that. But I think that's a real important piece. And then I think I'd actually probably come back to similarly to the coaches, I want practitioners to be curious and open to that consistent challenge of how do I ensure I'm working in a way that is best practice, athlete health. And that's what you've basically just shared with me, Brad, is that you're doing an incredible job. And honestly, you are the most, like, as a practitioner, I've never met someone who is so informed and so determined to do the right thing. It is just, it's so wonderful to see as someone who's had an experience and have so much trust in you because of that. But you're still so hungry to learn more and to do the right thing, and you're curious and you're open, and you're not afraid to go, do you know what, I got it wrong once before. And so I think that's what I really would love practitioners to take away is like, do you know what, you might not have always got it right, and that's okay. Be open to be challenged and be open to new practices because that's just constant growth, and you're going to buy trust from your athletes when you do that.
Gosh, so powerful, Jan. Be open and curious. This is the top three tips for the practitioners from Dr. Jan. Empower your athletes to be resilient. Eat enough, sometimes too much, never enough. Brilliant. Jan, every guest of the show over the 9 to 10 years to date has been issued two set questions. The first, if you could boil everything you've learnt through your own lived experience, sporting journey as an athlete yourself, uh, and then also your professional life into one piece of advice to help listeners of this show perform at their physical best, what would that one solitary piece of advice be, Jen?
Great question. To come back to my slogan, like it's literally eat enough, sometimes too much, never not enough. Like it's the one thing that I think I got so wrong, so many other people get wrong, and we still get it wrong. But if we could all do that, we would avoid so many cases of low energy availability and REDs and bone stress injuries. And in
Gosh,
terms of physical performance, like I don't think there's a better way of articulating it. Like if you don't get enough, we know that that's when we start to see the negative health implications, right? So that's my slogan, and it's going to stay that way. So that's my piece of advice.
brilliant. I think we put that as the episode heading. Dr. Jen Hamer, eat enough, sometimes too much, never enough. It
Never
sticks.
not enough. Never
What,
not enough.
never not enough. Sorry, never not enough. Yes. Uh, it makes me think in clinical practice, often on an endurance athlete's way out of the clinic, walking them to the front, I'll often say, don't forget to eat more than you think you need. Like, just keep fueling. But I'm going to replace that with Dr. Jen's. And then, Jen, the last question is a physical challenge for the week. What's Dr. Jen's physical challenge to the listenership going to be? It doesn't have to be physical per se. Sorry, Jen, we had a little delay there with the signal. Can you hear me? Hold on, I lost you for a sec.
The challenge for me, or is it for them?
Got you back. Sorry, I lost you for a sec. Yeah, for you issuing the listeners. So I'll just clap. We'll edit this little bit out.
Okay, so a physical challenge for the listeners. For me, it's get out in nature, 30 minutes of an activity that you enjoy. I cannot emphasize how much exercising in nature helped me through my own recovery. And I know a lot of people on this are people who are going through recovery from an eating disorder, but it is such a powerful environment to feel positive when you are moving. So whether it's running, walking, cycling, ocean swimming is a big one for me. 30 minutes in nature and you won't regret it.
Yeah. Brilliant and powerful. Dr. Jen, thank you for stopping by the show and sharing just some of your learnt wisdom. There's so much more to unpack, but hopefully there's a few key takeaways for the listeners. No doubt there is from today. So thank you very much for your time and for sharing your wisdom.
Thanks so much, Brad. It's been amazing.